Dr. Gunning Francis, thank you so much for joining me here today to sit down and talk about the upcoming public conversation, which you'll be moderating on November 14th at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. But before we dive into the public conversation, I do want to take a minute to celebrate your recent book that just came out called Faith After Ferguson, which follows an earlier book, correct?
Yes.
Called Ferguson and Faith. And so tell us a little bit about your work in Ferguson and what it is that you're learning.
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me here. I am excited about the conversation that we're going to have very shortly. So when the Ferguson uprising occurred in Ferguson, I was actually living there in the St. Louis area and was invited to write about clergy involvement in Ferguson. And so out of that came stories and interviews with clergy, young activists who not only were engaged in the movement on the streets, but were able to also talk about what this had to do with an expression of their faith. Like, this wasn't just something they were doing because they thought this was a good idea, which it is, but it also was integral to how they understood their life of faith and spirit. And so that book was very well received, and the publisher came back to me and said, "Oh, would you like to write a follow-up book?" Because the world saw the tanks and the tear gas across the television and computer screens during the Ferguson uprising, but many people don't know, well, what's happened since then. And so I went back to Ferguson, re-interviewed some of the previous people from the first book, as well as invited in some new voices to find out what's happened since then. And what we found is it is truly a movement of resilience. The kind of change that people hope to see, many people hope to see, is not the kind of change that often happens overnight. And so it's the intentional, ongoing work that has made it possible for some incremental changes to happen, but the broader movement for racial justice still is an ongoing enterprise, as you know. And so it was really an honor to be able to talk with people, as well as pull the narrative from Ferguson all the way up through the U.S. Capitol insurrection. Because as you know, so much has happened over these past 7 years as it relates to racial justice, and to be able to include many different kinds of stories to help get us thinking about what is the work that we all need to be doing right now to bring about true equality, liberty, and justice for all.
As you know, Spirit and Place has been on its own racial equity journey since 2015, and we have done and continue to do lots of inner work, and we've invited the community to join us in dialogue through a series that we have called Powerful Conversations on Race. And we invited Robert Jones to Indianapolis because we know from our own work that white supremacy is everywhere, including some spaces and places that are very hard for us to look at, such as inside our faith homes.
That is so true. And to be able to have a chance to sit down and to talk with Robert Jones about his book, White Too Long, where we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to untether Christianity from white supremacy. You know, a lot of times people hear that and grimace and say, well, that's not so. But as you know, in his book, he really lays out exactly how this came to be historically and helps us to think about what we need to do going forward, so that people of all faiths can understand that the shared values that we have of love, of justice, of empathy, of belonging is what needs to be in the foreground, and that just cannot coexist within a system of white supremacy.
Yes. And I'm so glad to hear you talk about all faiths, because at Spirit and Place we're dedicated to serving people of all faith traditions. And this event, however, is rooted very solidly in Christianity. Can you talk a little bit about how you hope to make this event relevant to our friends who aren't Christian?
Yeah, I hope that our friends across the religious spectrum and those who identify as not having a religious tradition at all, first can see the argument that's being made about how the meta-narrative, if you will, about religion and white supremacy is so rooted in Christianity, but at the same time, it is not ineffective for various faith traditions, because even though they're not Christian per se, every community, every religious community can engage in doing the work of looking at their own systems, their own structures, their own ways of being and organizing, to kind of do their own audit and say, oh my, how is white supremacy showing up even within our religious tradition?
Wonderful. And what are some of the topics you hope to cover with Robert Jones in this?
Well, we definitely hope to talk about the historical aspect of Christianity and the relationship to white supremacy, because this is not a new phenomenon. This isn't something that just started a couple of years ago, but has been going on for hundreds of years. And so to bring about that kind of educational awareness, I think will be very inviting for people to kind of draw in and understand a little more about how this came to be. Also, to talk about sort of the nuts and bolts. I hope we can bring up, what is it that we're asking people to do? In light of learning, okay, we learn the history, we know that the relationship between Christianity and white supremacy is rooted in our context. Okay, so what do we do about it? And the hope is to be able to have some real takeaways that the audience can see, oh wow, this is what undoing racism, confronting white supremacy in my context can look like. So for example, we're going to be at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, and as you know and many of the viewers know, this is a church that has taken a very firm stance for racial equity. You may recall that last year they hung a huge Black Lives Matter sign outside of their sanctuary on the side of their building. That's not unusual for churches to do. There are many churches around the country that hang Black Lives Matter signs. But what is unusual is for a church that has such a prominent position in the community in terms of, one, its location. It's on a main thoroughfare up and down Meridian. So people who, go from the north all the way downtown back and forth, they did not miss that sign. And so although a sign alone does not bring about racial equity, what it does is raise awareness and get people thinking. And so if your average person driving by can say, oh my, this well-known church here on Meridian, if they're taking this kind of stance, maybe I need to think about what it is that my community can do to address racial injustice.
Yes, and we were so excited to host this at St. Paul's, and It's a great combination of spirit and place with regard to this topic. What is it that you hope people will learn from this event, particularly white people? What do you think it is that white people will take away from this event?
I really hope that our white brothers and sisters come to take away that undoing racism, dismantling white supremacy is white people's work to do. Ultimately, it is white people that created this structure and that have the power to keep it in place. And so the hope is that this awareness that, dismantling racism really is white people's work to do, and that they might muster up the courage to be able to get involved in doing that work. Pam, so often people say to me, oh, Dr. Francis, I'm not an activist. I really don't feel comfortable going out and participating in a march. And I say, that's all right. Everybody does not show up for the work, doing the work of racial justice in the same way. For some people, it means beginning to have a conversation even with their family members and circle of influence. We have the holiday season coming up, and there may be families and friends that are gathering, and sometimes Uncle Joe or Aunt Sue might make a comment that is very racist. And instead of staying silent about it, to be able to speak up and initiate a constructive conversation. So there are so many things that people can do on what is considered a micro level within your own sphere of influence, your family, your neighborhood, your church community, for moms, the Moms Day Out clubs, all of these various kinds of gatherings, all the way to the macro level of dealing with systemic racism and changing it that way. But there is something for everyone to do.
Thank you, Dr. Gunning Francis, for joining me here today and for your participation in this year's festival. We so appreciate it.
It is my pleasure, and I look forward to the event.